Okay, I think we are good to go. Others, I'm sure, will join us in progress, but to everyone on screen, hello, good afternoon, and welcome to this webinar presented by the Israel Connections Committee of Congregation Darchei Noam. Thank you, each of you, for joining us and for what I know will be an insightful and informative program. This webinar, led by Rabbi Dr. Ron Kronish, is about Israeli and Palestinian religious leaders who together work and strive to build peaceful relations between their peoples. I'm Meyer Semiatiki, and I'll be moderating today's program. A big thank you and shout out to Simon Shapiro and to Judy Howard, who are at the controls hosting this session. As you can see, as you know, this session is being recorded. Disputes over land, of course, prevail in many countries, including here in Canada. We begin then with a land acknowledgement. Our Darchei Noam congregation is located on the traditional ancestral territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee. Toronto remains home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to live and build communities here. Issues of justice and redress remain as challenges. Our shul president, Sylvia Hunter, recently stated, "It's our responsibility individually and collectively to support truth and reconciliation." A good place to start is by joining the online learning programs which some of our members are offering and leading on this topic. You can find out more information about those sessions in our weekly shul announcements. Today, we will be hearing and learning about the peace-building efforts of Israeli and Palestinian religious leaders. Our guide will be Rabbi Ron Kronish, who has lived and engaged in interfaith work in Israel for many years. His presentation will draw from his latest book, Profiles in Peace, Voices of Peace Builders in the Midst of the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict. Get ready for an informative, maybe even hopeful discussion. Before introducing Rabbi Kronish, let me say two things. First, to Rabbi Kronish, I extend to you a very warm welcome on behalf of our Darchei Noam Rabbi, Tina Grimberg. A conflicting meeting has kept her away. Rabbi Tina did ask that I extend her personal greetings to you, and she added, quote, "I celebrate this program and its optimism." Next, let me quickly preview how today's program will proceed. Rabbi Kronish will speak for about 30 minutes or so. After his presentation, we will have a Q&A period, again for about 30 minutes or so. In order to field as many questions as possible, we are asking you to submit your questions directly to me through the chat function. You can enter your questions into the chat at any time, which I will then pose to Rabbi Kronish during the Q&A period. And now, to introduce Rabbi Ron Kronish, it's my pleasure to call on our DN member, Charlie Novogrodsky. Charlie has known Rabbi Kronish for many, many years, going back to their university days together at Brandeis University. Anytime that I've heard Charlie speak of Rabbi Kronish, it's with affection and admiration. So Charlie, would you introduce Rabbi Kronish to our audience?
Thanks, Meyer. Can you hear me? Put your thumb up if you can hear me.
We hear you.
Okay, great. Meyer, thank you, and thanks to the whole congregation, and especially those responsible for this programming. And Ron, hi.
Hi.
It's my honor to introduce you.
I thought I saw Myra also, yes?
Yeah, she's got my name underneath her on the little box. It's an issue in the marriage. Ron and I go back a long ways. We were at Brandeis University together in Waltham, Massachusetts. And we both grew up in the Miami region. We didn't know each other. My father, Abe Novogrodsky, of blessed memory, was a great admirer, Ron, of, as you know, of your father, Rabbi Leon Kronish, in the Miami area, also of blessed memory. And it's a very strong connection and honor for us to still be in friendship with one another. The group here should know, our audience should know, that Ron is the founding director of the Interreligious Coordinating Council in Israel. He's now an independent scholar, educator, speaker, and writer. Ron has lived in Jerusalem since 1979, serving as the director of the Interreligious Coordinating Council up until 2016, a director of the Office of the American Jewish Organization in Israel, many other positions, a lecturer in education at Tel Aviv University and at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Educated at Brandeis, Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion in New York, and in the Harvard Graduate School of Education, where he has his doctorate in philosophy and the history of education. Ron has published articles and essays on Jewish politics, faith, communities, and the peace process, as well as education, culture, contemporary issues in America and Israel. Ron, you've worked at the intersection of peace and war, at the intersection of the religious and the secular, at the intersection of the sacred and profane, all in a region that is infused with both faith and violence. So as a friend and a co-host here today, let me thank you for your courage and for your contributions to peace. Over to you, Ron.
Well, thank you, Charlie. It's wonderful to be with you all. I'm actually not in Israel. I came over to visit family. I'm in New York at the moment for a few weeks. But I'm very gratified at this opportunity to share some thoughts with you about my work in peace and peace building and peacemaking. So I want to begin by making a conceptual clarification that's been important to me over the years in talking to groups. In learning about this field, several years ago, I came up with a distinction between peacemaking and peace building, which has been useful to me. The peacemakers, as I understand it, are the politicians, diplomats, international relations people, lawyers, who get together periodically to try to make a formal peace accord between governments. So it's primarily a political act, and I have not been a politician, so I'm not in the category of what I call peacemaker, because I don't engage in creating peace accords with people. But the influence of the politicians and those who made peace agreements is very important. And when they were more active in the 90s, in the period of the Oslo Accords, and when we had peace with Jordan and the previous peace with Egypt from 79, it was very influential in Israeli society. So as opposed to the political peacemakers, I'm going to talk today about people who are probably less known to you, and those people I call peace builders. Peace builders is a term that refers pretty widely to all kinds of actors in civil society in Israel, whether it's religious leaders, educators, activists of various kinds, who engage not in the political process, but in the process of bringing people together through dialogue and education and cooperative projects to see if we can learn to live in peace together. So that's just a conceptual clarification that I want to make. I want to say that the organization that I led from 1991 to the end of 2014 kind of grew up with the peace process of the 1990s. And in longer lectures that I give to students and other groups when I have more time, I go through the peace accords of the 90s, which were very influential in my own work. So in 1991 and 92, many of you on this call will remember, we had secret talks known as the Oslo talks. Some of you have undoubtedly seen the play by now. It was on Broadway. And there are movies, Oslo Diaries. These Oslo talks were during the period of Yitzhak Rabin, when all formal negotiations were breaking down, and through dialogue in and around Norway, Israelis and Palestinian representatives of their governments reached the first historic agreement between Israel and the Palestinian people. Prior to 1991, you may know that our conflict was known as the Israeli-Arab conflict. That's because there was a lot of denial of the Palestinian people's existence, and because until that time, Israel fought several wars with Arab countries, which pretty much with the peace agreement with Egypt came to an end. So we don't fight wars very much with Arab countries anymore. Since the 90s, the conflict is known now as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and no longer as the Israeli-Arab conflict. So we had a peace agreement called Oslo 1 and 2 and 3. We had several of them. And until Rabin was assassinated in November 1995, we were on a roll in Israel. We had peace with Jordan, peace with the Vatican, and things were looking pretty hopeful until the summer of 2000, when the Camp David Accords, what's known as Camp David II, took place in the Maryland Hills. And there was great hope that Clinton, at the end of 8 years as president, wanted to have an agreement between Israel and the Palestinian people. And when Prime Minister Barak went to Camp David talks, the one headline in Israel said, "End of conflict in sight." So for me, the 90s was a decade of great hope. And I can remember, as do some of the peace builders I write about in my book, we remember these days of hope and euphoria where Palestinians threw flowers on Israeli tanks, and this the first agreements with the Palestinians we thought had the ability, the promise of leading to a comprehensive peace settlement. I won't rehearse the rest of the history. You know the history. For the last 20-some years, we've had no peace talks. There is basically no political peace process at the moment. It hasn't been for several years. For the historical record, the last peace agreement was signed in 1998, Wye River Memorandum. This is the pen that Bibi used when he signed it, see? And when I get back to Israel, I'll give it back to him to remind him that if you remember, he met Arafat and he shook his hand. And in 1998, he actually signed an agreement between himself and the Palestinians. So that's the last one. So it's almost 25 years since we have no peace agreement and no peace process. And therefore, my argument is that the only game in town, unfortunately, at the moment, of people engaging in peace work are people in civil society through the NGO world, what I call peace builders. Okay, now let me see if I can put up this shared screen that I played with before. Wait a second, don't go away. Where's my shared screen? Wait a second, I don't see, there it is. Wait a second, hold on. Shared screen. Okay, did that work?
Yes.
Yes, good, all right. So in the last couple of years, I sat down and I interviewed several peace builders in some depth. And I put out a book last September where I focus on the lives of 6 people. You can see from the photo, there are 3 Palestinians and 3 Jews. Some are religious, actually, some are religious and some are secular. Half are men and half are women. And they all have amazing stories to tell and lives that they've led. And I listened carefully, Mayor, to your introduction. When I self-published this book last September, I had a checklist of this publisher, and it said, where do you want your categories to be? And one of the categories I clicked was inspirational. So I view this as a kind of inspirational book with great stories of what people can do. Now I'm going to try to stop this share and show us a particular picture. Wait a second. Can I do this? No. I'm going to go back to that. Okay, I'll stay with this. So the first person I want to talk about on the Jewish side, maybe known to some of you, is Rabbi Michael Melchior. Anybody have heard Rabbi Melchior speak ever? Yes, okay. So Rabbi Melchior's story, he's an Orthodox rabbi. He's always dressed in black coat and black hat. He probably has black pajamas. And he's a modern Orthodox guy from Copenhagen. From his father was the chief rabbi in Copenhagen, who died a couple of years ago. His son is the rabbi of the same synagogue now. And he came to live in Israel as a young man. Early on, he was active in a Jewish peace movement called Nitivot Shalom, which is still around today. It's small but active. But you may have heard of him because he was one of the founders of a religious peace party called Meimad, which ran twice. But in 1999, he was elected to the Knesset, got one seat, and he joined with Ehud Barak in the Labor Party and was in the government for several years during the time of the Camp David II talks. And all the time when he was in Norway, and he was developing back-channel relations with Palestinians. The important story for Rabbi Melchior is that he has developed, along with several colleagues, Jewish and Muslim in particular, a project which he calls the Religious Peace Initiative. And his idea, which you can read about in depth after you buy my book, and you can get it free on Kindle Unlimited, for those of you who are on Kindle Unlimited. Rabbi Melchior's project, the Religious Peace Initiative, argues that the Peace of Oslo was a secular Tel Aviv type peace agreement, and it left out all the religious, by he religious, he doesn't mean us, he means the Orthodox Jews in Israel and the Orthodox Muslims. They were left out of the story. And since he argues they're a big part of the picture, he's been reaching out for decades now to, particularly to Muslims in the West Bank, but in Israel and in Egypt and other places, to try to develop stronger ties based on his understandings of Judaism and their understandings of Islam, to be voices for peace. And I think he's made great progress, although he doesn't get the kind of press I would like him to get in Israel anymore, since he's out of the government. So, Rabbi Michael Melchior is one of my heroes in the Jewish community. He's undoubtedly the leading interreligious Jewish peace builder in Israel. In his late 60s, still at it every day, very serious about what he's doing, and doing great work. On the Palestinian side, I want to mention a woman up on the top right. Her name is Huda Abu Arqub. Huda, I only met recently. She's a bit younger than most of the other people I interviewed in depth. Is a Palestinian woman who grew up in Jerusalem, was born in Jerusalem, but grew up in Dura, which is a suburb of Hebron, a town now sort of attached to Hebron. And she's got a fascinating story, and I'll just tell you a little bit about it, then you'll read the rest when you get the book. Huda became an English teacher from Al-Quds University in the early 90s, in the Oslo period, when the Palestinian Authority was cooperating with Israel and sending delegates to meet Israelis at all kinds of conferences in Europe and America and probably in Canada. And she went to a conference in Vienna in the early 90s and began to meet Israeli educators And as she says it poignantly, the only Jewish Israelis she'd met before then were soldiers, settlers, occupiers, people at the checkpoints. And all of a sudden, she goes to Vienna for a week and meets Israeli educators who are human beings and want to work with her on improving education about the other in both societies. And this changed her life. Huda then spent a lot of time abroad. She studied at a university in Virginia called Eastern Mennonite College, Eastern Mennonite University, where there was a famous professor, some of you may have heard of, John Paul Lederach, in conflict resolution. She wrote a master's thesis on Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, what they have to say about peace. And one more stop along the way, she spent 6 years in San Francisco working with a professor named Aaron Tapper. That's the brother of Jake Tapper from CNN. And they had a project called Abraham's Vision for several years, where they had Jews and Muslims in North America meeting each other in schools. And they had a second track of Jewish students and Palestinian students in universities entering into dialogue as opposed to standing on the opposite street and just shouting at each other, which is kind of, I think, what goes on today. So Huda finally comes back to Israel about 7 years ago, and she lands a job with a group called the Alliance for Middle East Peace. It's a group you probably haven't heard much about, and I like to shout out. The Alliance for Middle East Peace was started in 2004 by a young Jewish lawyer named Avi Meyerstein in Washington, D.C., I'm sorry, Washington, D.C. And they helped the American government direct monies for peace-building projects and programs in Israel and Palestine. They've been lobbying for many years. They actually got a law passed a couple of years ago, and it's something like $250 million are going annually to the region. And they've been working for years on developing an international fund parallel, something like the fund that was developed in the Irish conflict. And Huda is their regional coordinator, meeting with various groups on the ground. Now, according to their website, they have 160 groups listed as working for in peace-building programs and projects in Israel, Palestine, groups from abroad. That's a wide variety. I would love you to take a look at their website, Alliance for Middle East Peace, all MEP is the initials. And I've met her in the last few years, and she had great stories to tell, very honest about what it's like to live under the occupation, to grow up under it, what it's like now to work for peace in Israel and in Palestine in the current environment. And she's just as critical of her own government as we are of our government, which is very refreshing, I have to say. Okay, so I wanted to say one more a person on the top left, Gaia Golan. Some of you may have heard of her over the years. Gaia Golan is an American immigrant to Israel. She's now in her mid-80s. And she was a professor first at Hebrew University in Soviet studies. And later she wrote great books about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. She has a book analyzing all the peace agreements and how close we got and all the negotiations and all the near breakthroughs. And she's fabulous, a very brilliant woman. She also went to my university. So there you have it, our university, Charlie. And she was one of the founders of Peace Now. Peace Now has been around for, more than 40 years now. And lately, she's moved over to another organization. Peace Now is not strong enough for her. It's called Combatants for Peace. Combatants for Peace, if you haven't heard of it, is a joint Israeli-Palestinian peace-building organization that also borrows on the Irish model by taking people who were in former armed units in Israel, former soldiers in the IDF, and Palestinians who were in various militias, and kind of they've laid down their arms and they're working together for peace. They are kind of also not just peace building, but they do what I call advocacy work. They're very, advocating still for the two-state solution, and they have a political point of view. But she believes that working in this joint organization of Palestinians and Israelis is particularly meaningful in her life at this time. And if you haven't heard about it, and I can send you this afterwards, an email, the Combatants for Peace and another group called Bereaved Family Forum, Parents Circle Bereaved Family Forum. They're both veteran organizations by now. They've been around together. They co-host every year an amazing joint Memorial Day ceremony. Okay, they host it live in Tel Aviv at the fairgrounds. It was on Zoom for the last couple of years, and now it's both. It's hybrid. So it's tomorrow. Tomorrow is that? Do I have that right? Tomorrow? No. It's either tomorrow or the next day. Tomorrow's Erev. I think it's tomorrow. And last couple of years, because of COVID, thousands of people around the world were able to tune into this. And what they do is they have Palestinians and Israelis who've lost loved ones tell their stories at the ceremony and their songs. And it's just a beautiful ceremony. I used to go to it in person for several years, and then on COVID, and actually I have it on my calendar to watch tomorrow or the next day, even though I'm in New York. So Gaia Golan is a secular humanist. Her religion is humanism, who's been very, very involved in peace building work and has all kinds of fascinating stories to tell about how close we got to peace agreements, particularly under the Olmert government. Those of you who remember Israel's political history, under Olmert and Abu Mazen, there was a year or two where they were really negotiating, and they were almost there, and they were very close. And like I like to say, they were singing the right music to each other. And then, if you remember, Olmert had his corruption case, and unlike the current prime minister, he actually resigned and went to court, went to prison, and now he's out. Okay, I'm not going to tell you all about the peace builder, all the rest, because I want you, I don't want to spoil it. I want you to buy the book. But now I want to say a few final words before I open up to questions. And this is somewhat of a spoiler because I do talk about this in the end of the book. In my final little chapter, I call it an afterword, I raise the question that I've always been asked in my talks abroad over all these years: is peace possible? We once had a program that we did with Presbyterian seminary and a Jewish group where we sent kids, teenagers, to a summer camp in New York, upstate New York. There were Israelis and Palestinians, kids from South Africa, that's black and white, kids from America, and people from Northern Ireland, that's Irish, Protestant and Catholic. They would all go to these summer camp, and then we would work with them for an entire year. It was called Faith to Faith, Face to Face. And one year I was at a fundraising event in New York, and they're all standing, and there's a journalist interviewing, and they're under this huge banner, and it said, "Peace is possible." Well, it sounded great. So I asked them afterwards, some of them, what did they mean by that? What do they think that meant? And they said, well, we just lived in camp for 2-3 weeks with all these people who were in conflict, and we learned to live in peace together in 2 weeks, so it must be possible. Now, here's an argument I'm going to make for you. You don't have to buy it or accept it, but here's the point I want to say. I think when we look back at the peace agreements in recent decades, most of them we would have considered impossible the week before they happened. Okay, or the year before they happened. So if you remember the peace agreement with Sadat in the 70s. Who on earth imagined that Menachem Begin, from those days, the far right Likud party, the Beirut party, the revisionist party, Beitar, that he, after getting elected in 77, would meet Anwar Sadat, bring him to the Knesset and negotiate with Carter, and by 79 we had an agreement. That was not in the cards, and people to this day still talk about the surprise of the peace with Egypt, which was our great enemy for so many decades. All right. When Yitzhak Rabin was elected in 1992, June 1992, if you remember, Rabin was a man of the center right. He was not the left wing of the Labor Party. The left wing was Peres and Balin and the others. And he was a military man, right? So if you had said to me or anybody else, Yitzhak Rabin is going to shake hands with Yasser Arafat in Washington, D.C. next September, I would have said, you're telling me stories, okay? If you would have said to me, what are the chances of apartheid back then ending with the regime in South Africa? Did it look possible, all those people who fought for so many years? Well, nobody believed it would happen. So my argument is simply that we have had a lot of cases of surprises where peace processes where we thought were impossible actually did come to pass. And as I indicated, we've had several right-wing prime ministers in Israel who signed peace agreements with Palestinians. Therefore, I do not accept the argument that peace is impossible in Israel and Palestine. I do recognize that it's not likely right now in the current situation and the current government. But I do think that one of the things I've tried to do, and I'd say all the peace builders that I write about and have engaged with all these years, is to keep that hope for peace alive and not bury it completely because of the political situation looks bad at the current moment. So I am open to your questions.
Rabbi Kronish, thank you so much for this insightful, interesting talk. I've learned a lot already. I'm looking forward to the question period, especially knowing some of the interesting queries that have come on stream already, which I'll be putting to you in a moment. So let me remind everyone that we are, the chat is open for your questions, and Rabbi Kronish is also open to questions on any political, civil society questions you might have about Israel today, which of course we're following for a whole host of reasons very intently. We want to make this Q&A period as conversational and informal as possible. And to that end, I'm going to invite Charlie Novogrodsky, to feel free to add his voice, your voice, Charlie, with any questions, comments you might want to add into the discussion that's about to unfold from question period. So, all that said, I can report that the first flurry of questions relate to people wanting to know more about the contours and nature of peace building among Palestinians on the Palestinian side. And so one question is, are there similarities or differences we should be mindful of in terms of the outlook of Palestinians in their different geographic areas of residency, whether it's Gaza, whether it's the West Bank, whether it's East Jerusalem? Are there distinct orientations that arise among Palestinians in those different geographic areas?
Yes. Okay. So first of all, the Palestinians can be divided into different areas. First of all, there are Palestinian Arab citizens of Israel, right? 20%, 21% of the citizens of Israel we used to call them Israeli Arabs. Now most identify as Palestinian Arabs of Israel, which is a whole complicated story. But the point is that Palestinian Arabs who are citizens of Israel do not live under occupation. Military occupation ended in 1966, so they participate fully in Israeli democracy and courts and human rights organizations, and they have their own civil rights organization, and are very active in our politics. It's a vast gap. Then, if you move to East Jerusalem, it gets a little more complicated because East Jerusalem Palestinians essentially see themselves as part of the West Bank, although a fair amount of them are Israeli-Palestinian Arabs who came to study in Jerusalem and stayed behind. But the rest are psychologically Palestinians, part of the Palestinian people who they think one day will have a capital and part of East Jerusalem, and they're part of, and they see themselves still in a way under occupation, but they can vote in their situation is complex because they can vote in Jerusalem, but not in Israel. It's more complicated. But in general, there's a high level of coexistence among Palestinians in Jerusalem with Israelis. So you see them in the hospitals, in the pharmacies, in the hotels, in the garages, and it's very in the workplaces. It's very integrated. So I think it's less severe. Okay, then you go West Bank. West Bank is essentially ruled by the PLO, right? But that's Abbas in Ramallah. But they have a lot of Hamas folks operating. They cooperate security-wise with the Israelis in arresting Hamas people who threaten their rule as well. But Palestinians in the West Bank see themselves as living under occupation, and they are, and psychologically, and in fact, military occupation, and their situation. They come to the dialogues with a greater sense of victimhood than the ones that I talked about before. And of course, the folks down in Gaza, it's a whole other story. Gaza is ruled by the Hamas militant groups rejecting any peace agreements in theory. So this is why most of the wars in the last, or many wars we've had in the last decade or so, have been with the Palestinian Gazans, and there's virtually nothing going on there in the peace building world in Gaza anymore, except for a few people who keep up with their friends online across the border. Now, both sides come to the dialogue with a sense of victimhood, but the Palestinians feel a greater sense of depression and oppression than the Jews do right now. And I think correctly so.
Ron, your answer touched on and leaned towards a related follow-up question that came in about, is there pressure from the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank for Palestinian Arabs there not to engage in peace building?
Unfortunately, the answer is yes. There's a kind of formal and informal movement which they call anti-normalization. I had a project in my last years of my organization with a group in Bethlehem. I forget the name of it, and we were doing things with youth and with women and with travel, and we were bringing them money. And all of a sudden, one day, I get an email from someone that the board met last night, and they said, "That's it, we're done." Because even if you're a peace organization, there's pressure by actually government people and by others in society to not enter into things that normalize with Jews. So the Palestinian groups, and there are some who engage, are doing it against heavy pressure in their society. Professor Dajani, for example, who runs a group called Wasatiyah, and he took students to Auschwitz in 2014. He had Palestinian students. He taught at Al-Quds. He took them to Auschwitz. He took Jewish students, Israelis, to a refugee camp in Bethlehem, and he said Lahavdil in Arabic, making the difference. But when he came back from Auschwitz, there was so much pressure by students and by people in the PA, and they forced the administration of Al-Quds University, where he had taught for several years, to ask him to resign. So yes, there is heavy anti-normalization pressure. There's heavy pressure in the Jewish community too, but not as heavy and not as formal.
Ron, there are a couple of questions wanting to know more about the orientation of young people on both sides of both the Israeli and Palestinian. And I'll say as an aside, you likely know that Toronto and other places are actively involved in bringing together Israeli and Palestinian youth, adolescents, to spend time together here in the Toronto area, a heart-to-heart program. So, we're somewhat familiar with aspects of those efforts. But what's your take on the situation closer to the front lines of the orientation of young people?
So I and my organization work with young people for many years. The program you mentioned before, Faith to Face, went on for 11 years. And we actually had alumni from other programs who were college students and others. And I found that working with Israeli and Palestinian youth was very, very important. Fortunately, their youth and naivete helps them be less in despair, less thinking that the conflict will never end, and very open to meeting one another. And I saw great things come out of these meetings with young people who get to know each other for the first time, discover the humanity of the other. And I always felt that that's a very good place to invest resources. There was this great program called Seeds of Peace in the US, which was actually heavily funded and did a lot of great work for many years. And there's a program called Kids for Peace, which now merged with Seeds for Peace. There are several of these programs, and I've been involved with some of them. And I believe they're very important for the future, even though they don't make a difference, a great political difference at the moment. They're the kind of people who we need to be in place in the future, both in civil society organizations and in governments. So I put a lot of energy, and I saw a lot of great hope coming out of these meetings with young Palestinians, and young Israelis. They break down a lot of stereotypes that all Palestinians are terrorists, that all Jews are occupiers, and I wish we had a lot more of them. We have less now than we used to have because of the external pressures and the people in government. There used to be more government money going to these things. But anyone we have is very important. And if you're doing this kind of thing in Toronto or in other places, I think it's very key work for the future.
Meyer, can I jump in for a moment?
Please do, Charlie.
Ron, how would you help us understand, in terms of the wider civil society, the role of culture and artists these days? Many of us can remember musicians, writers, really important contributions from journalists. We'll call it the civil society and its artists, working as in their own way as peace builders, or at least to shine a light on prospects. How would you assess the current state of peace building culture and artists in particular?
So I'll share a story that just came up in I have a weekly phone call with Brandeis alumni, and one of the people who's in Israel now, I'm in New York, shared with me that some artists have been doing great work in the protest movement. So, for example, she said there's a new graphic with the number 75. When you read it from Hebrew, can look like the word lech, which means go home. And they're using 75 as lech for Bibi to go home. So it's interesting. I didn't know about this. I hadn't seen it yet. So I think the interesting thing now is that artists, journalists, all kinds of people, even high-tech people, scientists, are all gathering together in this great protest movement that's ignited Israel and maybe parts of the diaspora now. And it's becoming a very central part of our lives. And some of the, I don't know if you follow this, some of the two great cultural icons died in the last few weeks, both from Nahalal. There was an author, Meir Shalev, who a great author and children's books and known for his anti-occupation views, and Yonatan Geffen, another journalist and writer. It was buried yesterday or a couple days ago at the funeral. One of his daughters wore a polo shirt. You saw that said there is no democracy with occupation. So I think a lot of this is coming together. I think that the organizers of the resistance, I'll call it, are using these things very cleverly now, and I think it's very helpful. And because they're smarter and younger than we are, they can use it better and faster.
Ron, I've got a question actually that's a variant of Charlie's. I'm curious what role religious faith and detachment has in either being a pathway to bridges towards peace building, or does it become more of a barrier? In other words, both groupings have religious members and secular members. From your experience, is a strong religious attachment taking people towards an openness to peace building, or does it tend to go in the other direction?
Well, this is a long question, but religion and sociology of religion is a very, very different than in the diaspora. Okay. So, and part of it, I think, is related to the way the media interprets religion. So if you take Judaism and Islam, okay, so the prevalent perceptions in Israel, I think, is that Judaism is, I like to call it the religion of Joshua, not Isaiah, if you understand what I mean. It's a religion of a fundamentalist reading of the Bible, a religion which is heavily involved with Kanaut, extremism and zealotry. And that's the religion of large parts of Orthodox Jewry in Israel, which is the reason the so-called party called Religious Zionism got 14 seats. Nobody expected to get them 14 seats because, okay, part of they got those seats because they were going to do better on crime or something. But so there's a lot of folks who get educated in a very kind of different religious framework than you and I know about, okay? So that the Rabbi Melchiors of the world, in the Orthodox world, are not a large group, I'm sorry to be honest with you. And he's been fighting very extreme. When he had his political party and Maimad, and he was in the news a lot, I think he had more influence. But he's not considered in the media a religious leader anymore. And the same thing on Islam. In other words, Islam tends, the media has depicted it as radical Judaism versus radical Islam. And the folks, the Jewish settlers who were, you know about the pogrom that happened in a Palestinian village a couple of weeks ago. This doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes out of certain teachings in certain yeshivas in certain mountaintops in the West Bank. So unfortunately, I think the radicalized views of both religions are winning the day with the help of the media, which is why the religious peace builders are in the minority. They're few and far between, and they haven't taken over society, but they're there and they're persisting, and they keep their voices going. That's it's honest an answer I can give you to the situation. I mean, we have, as you probably know, a serious issue of fundamentalist Judaism and fundamentalist Islam, which are preventing things from moving forward. Okay, but you have to get behind some of that, and when you get behind some of that, you say, well, not everybody's like that. So, for example, even with Hamas is the Muslim Brotherhood. There are people who say there's a practical wing of a Hamas. They want to do a hudna. Hudna is a 10-year truce, and we can negotiate with Hamas. And we've done background, in between. So it's not like they're all, if you open the doors and you can find through the back door or the side door, rather than you maybe can find a way.
Ron, there's a question about what I'll call the architecture of the peace-building effort in Israel. You mentioned and Palestine. You mentioned a number of different organizations. Is there any effort to build an overarching umbrella organization? And would that be an appropriate next step or goal?
Well, that's good. When I was active 10, 15 years ago, there was a wonderful guy named Ron Pundak, who was a professor had been in he was part of the Oslo crew, and he organized a thing called Peace NGOs. And for a few years, we would have meetings with 50 Palestinian peace NGOs and 50 Jewish Israeli. And there were some really great meetings. And then then the violence got too great and the mistrust got too great, and it kind of fell apart. So there's still the Israeli peace NGOs, but the whole joint thing fell apart. The closest thing that I know to it now at the moment is what I talked to you about, this Alliance for Middle East Peace Coalition. They are trying in some way to do that. I mean, they have a staff now. They've gotten some money, some grants. They have 160 organizations. They have a local person working on it. Try to get many of them to work together. So that's the closest thing that there is at the moment, and it's worthwhile. And the people who run that, and especially this young man Avi Meyerstein, they really have a vision for the future. And they'll say, well, they did a project last year about young Palestinians and young Jews telling their stories. It's something storytellers, and they had 12 of them. And they said, well, if we multiply it by 100 or 10, we'll have 120. And they have a vision of where they want to get to, and I think it's important. And I wish more people would know about it. And they're on the right track, and they're trying to develop a strategy where more money will go to these programs, because they have been very poorly funded over the years, and everybody had to fight for their own funding, which they still do. So they, for example, they have a program called capacity building, where they're trying to help some of these small organizations grow. And that's, I think, very important. I should be clear, I'm sure you're aware, that all of these groups are fighting against the grain at the moment. In the current situation, I mean, we used to have governments who push these things, right? We don't have that now. So you have to, and not to mention all the security problems of meeting now. So this is not easy work in the current environment. But people have to persist and do what they can under difficult circumstances.
Speaking of the current moment and environment, there are a couple of questions that have come up connected to that, and essentially the current political crisis and mass mobilization of Israeli society around the proposed initiatives of the Israeli government. One side of the question is, any idea how Palestinians are regarding the political turmoil going on in Israel? And a second question, is it having any impact on the peace building project? Is there any connection?
Well, this is a good question. Let me say first that the mass protest movement that has developed in the last 3-4 months is largely a movement of the Israeli center. So they captured the flag as the symbol, and Israeli and Palestinians don't like marching under the Jewish flag. Even Israeli Arab Palestinians. So when they first started this movement, somebody raised the Palestinian flag at one of the demonstrations that caused a havoc. So there's kind of I don't know if it's a formal or tacit agreement, but I can tell you, I go to the Jerusalem Saturday night demonstration almost every week. And when you walk in, there's a group from the people from the further left, and they're carrying signs that say, "There is no democracy with occupation." So there'll be 15 or 20 of those people to raise your consciousness to that. No Palestinian flag. The rest of the people, the other 30,000, are wearing flags and Jewish slogans. And so the protest movement has become centrist, but the folks who've done it in Jerusalem, I happen to know the organizers, have combined right, left, and center. So some of their spokesmen, you can go every Saturday night, they have 4 people. They'll have a woman, an Arab, a religious person, the mix. They're trying to show there's diversity against this, and they always put in an Israeli Arab, even though there are no Israeli Arabs demonstrating. And so I think that's a problem, that the Palestinian Israeli Arabs have not been part of this. I'm talking about in Israel. And I hope that somehow, as this goes on, and it's going to go on for a while, because they will be affected. They know they will be affected by any change, but it's complicated now to integrate them into the movements, because the leaders are centrist people, from the reservists from the army, colonels, former Shabak, former Mossad. That's the people who are leading this, and they don't mix well with the Palestinians. Now, Palestinians in the West Bank kind of say, "Oh, we don't think you had a democracy in the first place. So what are you talking about?" And, they're kind of watching from the side. This is an Israeli internal issue, and you work it out. They're more worried about the daily things on the ground that Mr. Ben-Gvir or Mr. Smotrich are going to do against them. So this, to be very blunt, has not fully integrated the peace movement people, peace-building people, but you can find a lot of talk. Charlie mentioned journalists before, arguing for that integration. And people have to figure that out, because they are related. They are related. But this has not been the organizers, in order to make this large, didn't make this a left-wing movement. They made it a centrist movement. But some of them try to argue center, some right, some left, but and as you probably know, there are a variety of organizations in the peace building community too. Some are more what I would call liberal left, some are more radical left. You wouldn't get the largest we ever had in Israel a couple of weeks ago was 600,000 on one night all over the country. You wouldn't get those numbers out there against the occupation or something like that. It's just the reality of it. So, but nevertheless, I want to say that despite all that, the resistance movement, or this mass protest against these radical right trends in Israel, is a very hopeful sign, in my view. And I see some reverberance of it here in America. I don't know how much it's really out there. Maybe in Canada, you could say. But in Israel, I can tell you, the people who go, and we feel that we're making progress. We did get them to stop and halt. And I don't know if you saw in the news, I think there was this morning something that Bibi was supposed to speak to the North American Jews at the GA, and the protesters made it so it didn't happen. So, I think there's some hope that it reminds me, Charlie, of when we were younger and the protest movements that we did in America, which went on for, a long time. This is not a 2-week project. This is a project of a couple of years, and certainly of several months. And I think there's no intention whatsoever of people giving up, and it's very broadly based, but it doesn't reach the extreme left very much. It's trying, like in Jerusalem, they try. They give various people. You can give a speech at the Jerusalem rally and say you're against the occupation, and no one will boo and hiss you. But it's not the main thrust. But these rallies are very important to people. It's the new religion. It's the new civil religion. You know, it's people out there. I go with one of my daughters and son-in-law and 3 grandkids, and it's and it's just a feeling that that we're out, that people care deeply and care about the Jewish nature of the country, the values that so many of us grew up with, and yeah, I think it's very serious. I have a sense it's going to prevail, but I don't know. It's a very positive thing, quite an amazing development, I'd say.
Well, I think all of us who've had the pleasure of hearing you for an hour now know what a positive event and occasion this has been. Ron, you've given us so many interesting insights and even dashes of hope sprinkled here and there. I'm going to call on Charlie to more formally convey our appreciation to you, and then I'll come back and close just with reminders of where and how you can get hold of Rabbi Kronish's book. Charlie, over to you.
Thanks, Meyer. Ron, what a pleasure to spend a little time with you this afternoon, even though it's just by Zoom. I think I'm speaking for our audience when I say thank you for your time and your work. I don't know about the rest of the audience, but I can say, speaking for myself, that being with you this hour, I feel I've been in the presence of the sacred. I think that you are bestriding a sacred world, and at the same time, with a lot of courage and a lot of hard-headedness, keeping a foot in the political world and in the real circumstances of Israeli life and Palestinian life and Middle Eastern life. So I want to thank you for your faith and for keeping hope alive. And I was reminded, as you were talking about civil rights struggles and whatnot from earlier in our lives, about the role of music and the role of culture in keeping faith alive, the role of your book in keeping people's eyes able to focus on a better future. So we really appreciate the work you've done, the book you've written, and spending time with us this afternoon. Meyer?
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
I'm sure all of us echo that. I see some hands clapping and applause on various screens. I'll remind folks that I think my count is right. There are at least 3 ways that we can access Rabbi Kronish's book, which is titled, again, Profiles in Peace, Voices of Peace Builders in the Midst of the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict. Number 1, it's available through Kindle Unlimited, free of charge as a download. Number 2, it can be ordered from Amazon. Number 3, it can be ordered from Barnes and Noble. And both Amazon and Barnes and Noble have it available in hard copy and in ebook format. So those are pathways and routes. And Ron, I understand that you are regularly appearing in various Israeli publications.
The Times of Israel, I blog for pretty much regularly for about 11 years. And I just sent out a post today. I can send it to you if you want, and you can share it.
That'd be wonderful. That'd be wonderful. Yeah. You know, before we close, I've got a track record going, either intentionally or accidentally, of saying one silly thing each session I'm moderating. So here's my go for this session. I'm noticing you both have beams in the room that you are in that are painted green. Is that like a Brandeis thing, or like just a convergence of your commonalities?
I used to root for the Celtics. That's probably what
Okay.
And I still watch Boston Celtics games. Yeah, maybe.
Buy it honestly then.
All I can add to that is that when Ron and I were students together at Brandeis University, Bill Russell was a star
Yeah,
for
right.
the Celtics,
That's
and
right.
his main opponent was the great Wilt Chamberlain, 7
Mhm.
feet 2 inches tall.
Right.
And my beloved Myra, who's on this call, once belonged to a intramural team at Brandeis University that was called the Wilted Chamberlains. You had to be 5 feet 1 inches tall or shorter to be on that team.
That's great. That's good. Well, we do need a green world for the future, don't we?
Yes, we do. Yes, we do. So on many counts, a very good color choice. And I know we all feel on this call that we made a good choice spending our hour with you, Rabbi Kronish. Thank you for this.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful. I enjoyed your moderation.